Jacob Hayes had spent 20 years building his ranch. And in less than 6 months he was about to lose it. The warning came on a cold April morning. A rider from Helena arrived carrying an envelope stamped with the seal of the First Montana Agricultural Bank. Jacob was repairing a broken gate when the young messenger handed him the letter. He already knew what it contained. Bad news always arrived in official envelopes. Jacob wiped the dust from his hands and opened it slowly. The words hit like a bullet. Final notice. Unless the outstanding debt of $18,000 was paid within 90 days, the bank would seize the Hayes Ranch and auction every acre. Jacob folded the paper carefully. 20 years. 20 years of work. 20 years of broken fences, brutal winters, cattle drives, and sleepless nights. And now a few lines of ink threatened to erase all of it. The ranch stretched across nearly 12,000 acres of Montana land. Once it had been among the finest operations in the territory. But the past 3 years had been cruel. A drought had weakened the grazing fields. Several disease outbreaks had killed valuable cattle. Freight costs had increased. Profits had vanished. Debt had grown. Now the ranch stood on the edge of collapse. Jacob was 48 years old. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Weathered by years under the western sun. Most people respected him. Some feared him. Nobody knew him. His wife, Rebecca, had died 8 years earlier during a difficult winter fever. Since then, Jacob had buried himself in work. He rarely laughed. Rarely attended social events. Rarely allowed anyone close. The ranch had become his entire life. And now even that was slipping away. 3 days later, Jacob rode into Helena to meet the bank president. The office smelled of expensive tobacco and polished wood. Behind a large desk sat Harold Whitmore, a wealthy businessman whose family owned banks, railroads, and investments throughout the Western Territories. Whitmore looked uncomfortable. That worried Jacob. Bankers only looked uncomfortable when they were about to say something unpleasant. "Mr. Hayes," Whitmore said carefully, "I wish this meeting were under better circumstances." "So do I." The banker sighed. "You know your position." "I do. The board wants the debt settled." Jacob crossed his arms. "I don't have $18,000. "I know." "Then I suppose this conversation is finished." "Not necessarily." That got Jacob's attention. Whitmore opened a drawer and removed another document. "There may be another solution." Jacob narrowed his eyes. "I'm listening." The banker hesitated. "My daughter recently became a widow." Jacob blinked. "What?" "Her name is Clara." The banker continued. "She is 29 years old. Educated. Intelligent. Capable. What does that have to do with my ranch?" Whitmore looked directly at him. "She needs a fresh start." Jacob stared. Then laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was absurd. "You can't be serious." "I am." "You want me to marry your daughter?" "I want to offer an arrangement." Jacob stood up immediately. "No." "Sit down." "No." "Please." Something in Whitmore's voice stopped him. The older man looked genuinely worried. Not for the ranch. For his daughter. "Clara's husband died 2 years ago," Whitmore explained quietly. "She returned home afterward. Since then she's been trapped." "Trapped." "She wants independence. She wants purpose. She wants to build something of her own." Jacob remained silent. Whitmore continued. "If you marry her, the debt disappears." The room became very quiet. $18,000. Gone. Just like that. The offer felt ridiculous. Yet it would save everything. "I don't even know her." "You will." "What if she hates ranch life?" "She won't." "What if I hate her?" Whitmore smiled slightly. "Then you'll be no worse off than you are now." Jacob rubbed his forehead. This sounded insane. But losing the ranch sounded worse. 2 weeks later the agreement was signed. And Jacob spent every day regretting it. He imagined some spoiled city woman arriving with trunks full of dresses. Someone who had never touched dirt. Someone who would complain about every inconvenience. Someone completely useless on a ranch. The more he imagined her, the worse the situation became. By the time Clara arrived, Jacob was convinced disaster was coming. The train station in Helena was crowded. Passengers stepped off carrying luggage and greeting relatives. Jacob searched for a wealthy widow. A woman dressed like Eastern royalty. Instead, he noticed a woman carrying 2 small suitcases. No servants. No fancy entourage. No drama. She wore a practical blue traveling coat. Her dark brown hair was pinned neatly behind her head, and she walked with confidence. When her eyes met his, she approached immediately. Jacob Hayes. Yes. Clara Whitmore. She extended her hand. Jacob shook it. Her grip was surprisingly firm. Not delicate. Not weak. Strong. You came alone? He asked. Yes. No servants? No. No family? She smiled slightly. I'm 29 years old, Mr. Hayes. I don't require supervision. That wasn't the answer he'd expected. The ride back to the ranch took nearly 6 hours. Most Eastern women would have complained. Clara didn't. Instead, she asked questions. Hundreds of them. How many cattle? Approximately 8,000. How much debt remains besides the bank? Several supplier accounts. How many ranch hands? 23. What are your annual operating costs? Jacob glanced sideways. You ask unusual questions. Those seem like normal questions. Not for a newly arrived bride. Clara shrugged. Perhaps I'm an unusual bride. By the time they reached the ranch, Jacob felt strangely exhausted. Not from the ride. From trying to keep up with her mind. She seemed to analyze everything. Nothing escaped her attention. The barns. The corrals. The water systems. The grazing fields. Everything received careful observation. Finally she spoke. You're wasting money? Jacob nearly fell off his horse. Excuse me? The feed storage building is too far from the north corrals. You figured that out from one look? Yes. You can't know that. I can. Jacob sighed. This woman was either brilliant or completely insane. Possibly both. The wedding happened 3 days later. It was small, simple, private. A traveling preacher performed the ceremony. A few ranch hands attended. No fancy decorations. No elaborate celebration. Just two strangers making an agreement. When the ceremony ended, Clara became Mrs. Clara Hayes. Neither of them knew what came next. That evening, after supper, Clara surprised him again. I'd like to review the ranch accounts. Jacob looked up. The what? The account books. Why? Because I want to understand our business. Our business? Yes. She smiled. We're married now, aren't we? Reluctantly, Jacob brought the ledgers. Most people found accounting painfully boring. Clara treated it like treasure. She spent hours reading every page, occasionally making notes, occasionally frowning, occasionally muttering to herself. Near midnight she closed the final ledger. This ranch isn't failing because of drought. Jacob frowned. What? Drought hurt you? Yes. But it isn't the real problem. Then what is? You. That answer nearly started an argument. But Clara continued before he could respond. You're an excellent rancher. I know that. You're a terrible businessman. I beg your pardon. You don't negotiate supply contracts. You overpay transport companies. You fail to track cattle losses properly. You purchase feed inefficiently. You don't leverage seasonal pricing. Jacob stared. How do you know all this? My father owns banks. So, I spent years studying business. She tapped the books. These records tell a story. And the story says this ranch could earn 40% more profit without adding a single cow. For the first time, Jacob wasn't annoyed. He was curious. Very curious. The next morning Clara began working. Not giving orders. Working. She spoke with ranch hands. Inspected equipment. Reviewed contracts. Studied operations. Many workers laughed behind her back. A city widow running a ranch? Ridiculous. Impossible. The jokes spread quickly. Clara ignored all of them. Then came the incident that changed everything. One afternoon, a supplier arrived demanding payment for feed. The man claimed the ranch owed nearly $2,000. Jacob prepared to pay. Clara stopped him. Show me the invoices. The supplier smirked. Little lady, this is business. Yes, Clara replied calmly. Which is exactly why I want the invoices. Minutes later she discovered the fraud. The supplier had charged the ranch twice for multiple shipments. For 3 years. The total overcharge exceeded $4,000. The man turned pale. The ranch hands stopped laughing. Jacob stared in disbelief. Clara handed back the paperwork. You can leave now. The supplier left immediately. That evening nobody questioned her intelligence. And for the first time since Rebecca's death, Jacob felt something unfamiliar. Oh, not because the ranch was saved. Not yet. But because Clara Whitmore Hayes was clearly not the helpless widow he had expected. She was something entirely different. Something dangerous. Something brilliant. And deep down, Jacob began to suspect that the unexpected woman who had arrived on a train from Chicago might be the only person capable of saving the Hayes Ranch. The winter after Clara arrived was one of the harshest Montana had seen in years. Snow-buried fences. Water troughs froze solid. Temperatures dropped low enough to kill weak cattle overnight. For many ranchers, it was a disaster. For Jacob Hayes it was a test. And for Clara it was an opportunity. By the time the first snowstorm arrived, she had already spent 6 months transforming the ranch's operations. She reorganized supply contracts, negotiated lower freight costs, created detailed records for every herd, established seasonal budgets, tracked profits and losses down to the last dollar. At first the ranch hands resisted. They weren't used to taking instructions from a woman, especially one who had arrived from the city. But Clara never argued. She simply proved herself again and again. When she predicted feed shortages before anyone else noticed them, she was right. When she suggested moving cattle to different grazing areas, she was right. When she warned that certain suppliers were overcharging, she was right. Eventually even the most stubborn cowboys stopped questioning her. Success had a way of silencing critics. One snowy evening, Jacob sat across from Clara in the ranch office. Ledgers covered the desk. The fireplace crackled softly nearby. Clara finished writing a column of numbers and smiled. Jacob noticed immediately. What is it? We made a profit. Jacob blinked. We always make some profit. No, Clara said. I mean a real profit. She turned the ledger toward him. The numbers were remarkable. Despite droughts, rising costs, and winter expenses, the ranch had earned nearly twice what it had earned the previous year. Jacob read the figures twice. Then a third time. Is this accurate? Every penny. For a moment he couldn't speak. For years he had worked harder and harder while earning less. Yet Clara had increased profits in less than a year. Without expanding the ranch. Without increasing cattle numbers. Without borrowing additional money. Just through intelligence and planning. Finally Jacob laughed. A genuine laugh. The first one Clara had heard from him in months. I suppose I should stop doubting you. You should have done that months ago. He smiled. You enjoy being right, don't you? A little. A little? A lot. For the first time both of them laughed together. Something changed that evening. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. But noticeably. The distance between them began to disappear. The marriage had started as an arrangement. Then it became a partnership. Now it was becoming something more. Neither spoke about it. Neither needed to. The feelings grew quietly. Like roots beneath the soil. Invisible. But powerful. The following spring brought new opportunities. Clara proposed an ambitious plan. We should start breeding premium cattle. Jacob looked skeptical. That requires investment. Yes. Risk. Yes. Years before returns. Yes. Clara folded her arms. Every great business requires patience. Jacob studied her. You've already planned everything, haven't you? Of course. She pulled out several pages of calculations. Projected costs. Expected profits. Breeding schedules. Expansion strategies. Jacob shook his head. You planned this before asking me. I knew you'd need convincing. And? She smiled. Was I right? Unfortunately, she was. 6 months later, construction began. The ranch invested heavily in superior breeding stock. Neighbors called them reckless. Competitors predicted failure. Some openly laughed. But Clara ignored them. She always focused on the future. Not public opinion. 3 years passed. The results were extraordinary. The Hayes Ranch became known throughout Montana. Buyers traveled hundreds of miles to purchase cattle. Prices increased dramatically. Profits exploded. Land was acquired. New barns were built. Additional workers were hired. For the first time in his life, Jacob wasn't merely surviving. He was thriving. And everyone knew why. One summer afternoon, a wealthy investor from Denver arrived. His name was Richard Caldwell. He toured the ranch, examined the cattle, reviewed financial records. By sunset he was astonished. "This operation is remarkable." Jacob nodded. "It does well." Caldwell laughed. "That's an understatement." His eyes shifted toward Clara. "The real genius is your wife." Jacob smiled proudly. "Yes." The answer surprised him. Not because it wasn't true. Because he no longer felt threatened by it. Years earlier he might have been embarrassed. Now he felt proud. Very proud. The investor eventually offered $50,000 to expand operations. It was more money than Jacob had ever seen. The expansion transformed everything. Within 5 years the ranch had doubled in size. Their cattle operation became one of the largest in Montana. New businesses followed. Horse breeding, land investments, supply contracts, railroad partnerships. Every year brought new success. And through it all Jacob and Clara worked side by side. One handled the land. The other handled the numbers. Together they became unstoppable. But success wasn't the greatest gift they received. That arrived one autumn morning. Jacob was repairing a corral when Clara approached. She looked nervous. That alone caught his attention. Clara rarely appeared nervous. "Jacob." "Yes." "I need to tell you something." His stomach tightened. "What is it?" She smiled softly. "We're going to have a baby." For several seconds Jacob simply stared, unable to process the words. Then emotion hit him like a runaway horse. Joy, disbelief, hope, all at once. He wrapped his arms around her. For the first time in years tears filled his eyes. The ranch had given him success. But Clara had given him something even greater. A family. 9 months later their daughter was born. They named her Emma. She inherited Clara's intelligence and Jacob's stubborn determination. 3 years later came a son, Daniel. The ranch grew. The family grew. Life grew. Everything seemed perfect. Then disaster struck. A severe drought swept across Montana. Grass disappeared. Rivers shrank. Thousands of ranchers faced ruin. Many were forced to sell their land. Others lost entire herds. Panic spread across the territory. Jacob feared the worst. But Clara remained calm. She had prepared for this years earlier. Emergency feed reserves. Water storage systems. Financial reserves. Alternative grazing agreements. While competitors struggled, the Hayes Ranch survived. Not comfortably, but successfully. By the end of the drought, many neighboring ranches were bankrupt. The Hayes Ranch emerged stronger than ever. Word spread quickly. Newspapers wrote articles about Clara Hayes. Businessmen traveled to meet her. Ranch owners requested advice. Soon she became famous throughout the territory. People called her the woman who saved Montana ranching. Clara hated the title, but it followed her everywhere. One evening years later Jacob and Clara sat together on the porch. The sun was setting across endless fields. Golden light covered the ranch. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. Their children played near the barn. For a while neither spoke. Then Jacob finally broke the silence. "Do you remember the day we met?" Clara smiled. "You looked terrified." "I was terrified. You thought I was a spoiled city widow." "I did. And now?" Jacob laughed softly. "Now I think you're the smartest person I've ever known." Clara squeezed his hand. "Good answer." They sat quietly, watching the sunset, watching the ranch they had built together, watching the life they had created. 20 years after Clara arrived, the Hayes Ranch had become one of the most successful operations in the American West. They owned thousands of additional acres. Their businesses stretched across several territories. Their wealth exceeded anything Jacob had once imagined. But when reporters asked him how it happened, he always gave the same answer. It started when a woman everyone underestimated stepped off a train. And when reporters asked Clara for the secret of her success, she always smiled and said, "I found a man willing to listen." In the end, their legacy wasn't the money. It wasn't the land. It wasn't even the famous ranch. Their true legacy was the partnership they built. A partnership based on trust, respect, patience, and love. The widow who arrived looking for a new beginning had found far more than that. She found a purpose, a family, and a future. And the lonely rancher who believed he was saving his ranch discovered something even greater. He had found the woman who would save his life.